Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series on the 2016 World Championship between Sergei Karyakin and Magnus Carlsen. Karyakin led 1-0 after the 8th game, and Carlsen equalised in the 10th game. So there was only 2 games left. Both of those were draws. So then they entered into a series of 4 10-minute rapid games. They might have been 15 minutes with 10 seconds increment. They might have been 25 with 10 seconds increment, but they were rapid. They were rapid games anyway. The first 2 rapid games were drawn, and this is a third rapid game where Karyakin has the white pieces. Let's see what happens. So e4, e5, very standard stuff. Ruy Lopez. Bishop comes to b5, Spanish or Ruy Lopez. He isn't really threatening to take the pawn and then win the knight, because if he takes the pawn, then you take back with the d pawn so that the queen is open, and when the knight comes here, you can come here with the queen and it's a fork on this pawn and this knight, and you gain your pawn back in a probably favourable position. But you are threatening to defend the pawn and then defend the e pawn and then win your opponent's e pawn. So Magnus puts the question to Karyakin: do you want to take that knight, or were you just pretending? Again, this was played in the first World Championship match. And Karyakin replies, I'll let you know in a minute, which is standard. This is the standard in the Morphy variation. And Magnus, it's the opening, so of course he develops another piece. And no, Karyakin castles. Castling is very useful. It's not just to get the king in safety, but it's to defend the e pawn with the rook on e1. Whilst the king isn't castled, you can't afford to take this pawn, because when the rook comes to e1, then you get a discovered attack on the king eventually. So Carlsen puts an end to that discovered attack and develops the bishop at the same time, so that now he is threatening to take the pawn on e4. And Karyakin defends it with the standard d3. Carlsen plays b5. So before, when Karyakin said, I'll let you know in a minute, it was too late. It's to be done there and then, or it was possible to take away the possibility forever. Again, this is all very, very well-known, highly theoretical stuff, which has been played for hundreds of years. So the pawn comes to d6, so that the pawn on e5 is properly defended, and so that the bishop is free to take part in the game. Pawn comes to a3 to give a retreat square to the bishop and to make possible queenside expansion with b4. Carlsen castles, the knight comes out, and the knight comes to a5, attacking the bishop. The bishop comes to a2, and the bishop comes to a6. Couldn't he have just done that without moving the knight? Well, he could, but with the knight here, maybe he could play the knight here to block that attack, and here he hasn't really got the opportunity to block the attack. So he chases the knight away, the knight retreats to where it came from, and then instead of swapping the bishops off, he puts the knight in the way. So there's built up a fair bit of tension here. And the knight comes to d4, where it's threatening to take the knight on f3. And the knight on f3 comes to g5, where it's threatening the bishop on e6. So he takes with the bishop. This gives up the bishop pair. And the pawn takes. If he takes with the bishop here, then c6 comes, which just allows him a quick central expansion and build up of a strong centre. So he has to take with the pawn and accept that little bit poor pawn structure. Also, the disadvantage of having the pawn on d5 is that it blocks for the bishop, and that's the only diagonal that the bishop has got, and we'll never be able to take this pawn, so it will never be able to open up that diagonal. This could lead to what's called a bad bishop strategy, because this is a bad bishop and this is a good knight. He could look for an endgame where that good knight is playing against that bad bishop. But he retreats the knight to d7 because this is a threat on the knight on g5, because it's now got a battery of queen and bishop against it. It's only defended by the bishop. And so the knight retreats, but it retreats to e4, a better square. But one advantage of this pawn blocking is that this bishop no longer has pressure on this diagonal, so the f pawn can move, and he moves and chases the knight away. This gives Carlsen more space on the king side, and he moves the pawn straight away. He could have kept restraining the knight, but he would just prefer to have more space. So the knight is chased away, and the knight comes to f5. You notice now that with the chasing away of the knight, it might be possible to play bishop to b1 and then have the use of this diagonal. Sorry. Once this pawn is moved. So the knight comes to e4. I'm not entirely sure, but it might be that he is thinking at some point in time to play the bishop out. This bishop now also is a bit restricted. It was even more restricted with the knight on d2 than it is now. The queen comes to e8, a common motif here. He's thinking of coming here and maybe launching some kind of kingside attack. Yeah, the bishop comes to b3. It may be that he's thinking about playing queen here and queen here to create a battery. It might be that he's just thinking about playing pawn here to break open the king side, and he would rather be able to take with the bishop than have to take with the queen. Queen comes to g6, transfer to the queen side, king side as I promised, and the pawn comes to f3. It does weaken this diagonal, but it's very difficult for either this bishop or this queen to exploit, and it makes the knight more solid in the middle. Also opens up defensive possibilities on the second rank, so that if Carlsen now plays knight here to threaten mate, then he's got rook to f2, rook to a2, queen to c2, all of which defend against the mate. So the bishop prevents the rook from coming to f2, and a little bit of expansion. The knight comes to f6 to chase this knight away, or possibly to play knight here, with a future thought of playing knight here, sacrificing it, getting pawn on here, and then queen gets on here, mate follows very quickly. So he's working towards a kingside attack. The queen comes to e2. It's just in a better defensive position here. This is a very smart move by Carlsen. He gives away a pawn to break open lines on the queen side, even although he is attacking on the king side at the moment, and most of his pieces are concentrated there. He does realise that open lines on the queen side will favour him and his attacking play, despite the loss of a pawn. So he takes it. Carlsen takes back, so that if the rook takes, and he ends up with the only rook on the open A file, which has access to squares like A2 and A1. So he moves the knight, it moves the bishop so that the rook is defended. The pawn is taken, and the pawn is taken. The knight comes to e3, so fantastic. He's got his knight on a really dominating position on the square e3. Octopus, that Octopus would be proud of, as James from Epic Chess says. Yeah, it comes to c1. Why not? This pawn's weak. This file is semi-open. But as soon as the rook comes to c1, he's committed the rook. So he takes, so that it's taken him 2 moves to get his rook to a1, where he could have done it in 1. Queen comes to a8 and attacks the b5 pawn. This is defended by putting the bishop in, the worst position you could pick on the board. The only thing that could make that bishop any worse, any more of a tall pawn, would be to put a pawn on b3. No prospects in either direction for that bishop. The only place it can go is come back where it came from, and of course this drops this pawn. So this bishop has become completely useless at the moment. The king comes to h8 because he doesn't want a movement of this pawn to be checked, so that he might be in a position to play c6 and begin breaking up the queenside structure. The king is also safer on h8. So the knight takes. He's going to try and make some space for his pieces. Maybe he can now think about playing d4. Bishop takes. So Carlsen is on the 6 pawns each, actually. But look at the structure for Kariaki compared to the structure for Carlsen. Fantastic. So rook comes to a3. Pawn comes to e4. The rook had to come to e3 so that there wasn't a direct threat on the unprotected bishop when the pawn comes to e4, so that he could take the pawn back. So he sacrificed a pawn back again, and the bishop takes on c3, and the rook takes, and now he's got 6 pawns against 5. But the open lines are very much in Carlsen's favour. Queen comes to e5, attacking the rook, and maybe threatening to come in here. If he gets on this diagonal, well, a smothered mate looks very likely. So the rook comes to a1, c1. The rook comes to a8, the queen and rook are a lovely battery on that square. He tries to make himself an escape square, that's wise, and Carlsen does the same thing. The king uses that escape square, and the queen comes to d4. Yep. Fantastic. And much better placed, more centralised queen. Threatening the bishop so that, alright, it's defended by the queen and rook at the moment, but it means that the queen and rook have to keep defending that bishop, which is attacked 2 times. So the queen comes to d1. Alright, still defended here. Queen comes to b2, so he's threatening mate here. Doesn't want to win the bishop. Would rather have a mate threat here. So he plays queen to b2, threatening mate. And the bishop comes to c1 to defend against the mate. And the rook comes to a2 to strengthen the attack on the g2 pawn. And Karyakin tries to break out by taking a pawn. Maybe he can get some kind of perpetual threat with playing the rook here. Maybe. So Carlsen plays rook to a1. He's threatening the queen. If the queen moves, of course, the rook drops. If the queen moves here, not the rook, the bishop drops, and then the knight takes with check. King would have to come back, and then the knight can come here, discover check. When the king comes here, rook here would be mate. So he can't move the queen, and if he puts the rook in the way, then Carlsen takes the rook with the rook, and the same still applies. So there is no defense any longer for Karyakin. and suddenly Carlsen leads by 1 with 1 rapid game to go. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks, bye.